Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading The Warmth That Changed It All by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 61, Last Minute Confession. It had already been a long day. It had started off fine. She'd woken from a decent sleep, texted her beautiful girlfriend, had a pretty good breakfast with Jock having already left for work. When she had arrived at college though, things had begun to take a turn. It was hard for Weiss not to notice when people actively avoided her. Granted, she didn't have many actual friends at Beacon, since it was more for learning than anything else, but she liked to think she had a relatively good relationship with her fellow students. That seemed to have changed, however, and people had begun to move to other tables when she sat nearby. How her questions would be met with short, to-the-point answers, if they even answered at all. Even the professor seemed to be giving her a wide berth, though Weiss was unsure as to why that was. That had just been college, though. During her lunch break, she had received a call asking her to come in for an emergency meeting, a meeting that had run over by 30 minutes and made her miss her next class. With the professors already treating her like they would be in danger if they even talked to her, she couldn't really imagine Professor Mulberry cared so much about her absence. However, there was one teacher who hadn't changed their behavior at all, which was excellent news since Weiss had to meet with her that day too. Thankfully, Headmistress Goodwitch had been just as stern and no-nonsense as usual for their entire meeting. "Well, Miss Schnee." The stern blonde peered over her tablet from behind a pair of oval glasses, her green eyes gleaming in the light that shone through the window. The designer, white blouse she wore was clean and crisp, as was the midnight purple skirt. "Considering your grades, I don't believe taking 10 days off would be much of an issue. Provided you catch up with your work after you return, of course." "Of course," Weiss said with a smile. "I'm sorry that it's so soon after the semester has started." "It's fine," Headmistress Goodwitch said with a wave of her hand. "I understand all too well how demanding it must be to be the heiress to a company." "Very," Weiss confirmed politely, and pulled her bag back over her shoulder. However, before she could even start to stand up, Glinda placed her tablet on the desk and cleared her throat. "Actually, Miss Schnee," she said, a careful cadence to her voice that Weiss had never heard before. While the woman cared for her students, it was very rare that she was anything but to the point. "There is another thing that I would like to discuss with you, if you have the time." Weiss glanced down at her watch and saw that it was almost 3. Her next meeting wasn't until 4:30, so she gave a nod and returned her bag to the floor. The woman clearly understood the gesture and gave a strained smile. "Thank you." She let out a breath and leaned back in her chair. "Since it isn't too pleasant a subject, I will keep it brief. As you are probably aware, Beacon University receives a generous amount of donations to keep our various departments running. Those donations go towards such things as food, board, and most importantly, scholarship. However, in light of recent events, the Board of Trustees, along with multiple parents, have expressed concern with where that money comes from. So, I'm afraid I have to inform you that we don't think it would be wise to accept the usual STC donation this year." Weiss would have loved to say she was surprised that she hadn't expected even more bad things to follow the events that she had set into motion, but she wasn't. It explained why the teachers had seemed so distant all day at least. Nevertheless, as much as it annoyed her, she had to keep wearing the mask of a businesswoman. "That's most unfortunate," she said with a sad sigh that wasn't entirely forced. "But I understand. I can hardly say that it isn't a dangerous time to be associated with my company." "I'm sorry, Weiss," Glinda said softly and straightened her glasses. "I don't agree with the decision. I would rather not have to forego scholarships this year, but it's not my choice to make." At the mere mention of what was going to be affected, Weiss felt a shiver of dread run through her. "SCH scholarships?" "Yes. The STC is our biggest donor due many of our students finding work there after they leave here, so naturally that money goes towards the biggest expenditure, which is scholarships." "So you won't be offering any scholarships this year?" "We may offer a few," Glinda replied, her eyes narrowing as she clearly caught onto the slight hint of desperation Weiss knew had slipped into her voice. "But even that would be a stretch, and only a handful at most. Though I am curious as to why you seem so affected." "How could I not be?" Weiss practically screamed internally. Everything Ruby had been working hard for over a month had just gone up in smoke. All those hours of volunteering wasted, and not through any fault of Ruby's. No, It was definitely her own fault. She hadn't thought of everything. She hadn't taken into consideration just how many dominoes her action could cause to fall. The staff, Atlas, now Ruby. How many more people would pay for what she'd done? What would Yang say when she found out that Ruby now had almost no chance of getting into Beacon when they had both encouraged her to go for it? And how would Ruby feel? All that work for her dream college. How would Ruby feel when she found out that there were no scholarships left? When she realized that it would be so much harder to get into the STC without that on her resume? The girl already had enough difficulties in her life, and Weiss hated that she had not just added another one to it. And maybe Ruby would hate her too. Weiss shook her head in an attempt to get those thoughts out while keeping her voice as level as she could.
I know how important they are to people. That's why my grandfather started the donations. I'm not happy about it either.
The woman sighed and picked up her scroll again.
Kneeling to threats to not give students the education they deserve is not something I like doing, but the safety of the students does come first. I agree,
was said with a firm nod. Despite not liking that Ruby might not get a place she absolutely deserved, she couldn't deny that the Academy's choice to put student safety first was definitely the right one.
I'm glad you understand.
Glinda smiled and tapped a few buttons on her scroll, her brow furrowing.
I'm sorry, I'm afraid that is all the time I have for today, Miss Schnee.
Oh, of course. From the urgency in the woman's voice, Weiss knew she shouldn't dally. So she quickly picked up her bag again and stood up.
I will be sure to catch up the moment I return.
The only thing she received in return was a rushed nod. The woman was already too caught up with whatever was appearing on her screen, so not wanting to bother her anymore, Weiss turned and slipped out of the room. Even as she walked her way through the college towards the exit, people moved away from her without any attempt to be subtle. However, as opposed to when the day started, she was struggling to care as much. She had already screwed up so much, and knew she'd already screwed up so much that she probably deserved it. Would Yang even tell her she didn't anymore? No, Weiss sighed to herself. If there was one thing that could be counted on, it was that Yang would never tell her she deserved to feel such a way. She might be annoyed, might even be a little hurt, but Weiss knew with absolute certainty that Yang would never say she deserved to hurt like she did. Though she still wished she could see her to make sure. But she couldn't. Not until they finally met each other in Mistral tomorrow. They had agreed that it would be for the best to not be in contact over the next couple of days, just in case, but Weiss was already regretting it. The days no longer felt right without Yang, they hadn't for some time, and she hated every single one that passed without them talking. The girl simply made everything better, and always put her mind at ease when she was stressed, and Weiss knew she could no longer live without that anymore. But she had to. She had to live just one more day. The moment they saw each other in Mistral, the moment they met each other again, they would never have to be separate again. Whether her trip was successful or not, they were telling Jacques when they got back. And that was something Weiss could not wait for. In fact, it was one of the only things that put some semblance of a smile on her face as she walked out of the front doors and towards the car park. Unfortunately, that smile soon faded as she exited the gates. In addition to the reporters that had once again become the norm, her car wasn't parked where Hazel would usually park it. Instead, it was in a completely different spot, and a man with long brown hair that covered one of his eyes stood beside it. Feeling herself on edge immediately, she straightened her posture and walked up to the stranger.
"Who are you?"
she demanded. D. His voice was clearly trying to sound professional, but the arrogance behind it was unmistakable.
"I'm here to pick you up." "I think you're mistaken,"
she fired back.
"I already have a driver." "Where is Hazel?" "Not coming."
The cold drawl filled her body with ice, and she turned to see that the window of the car had opened to reveal Jacques glaring daggers at her.
"Get in the car, Weiss."
With a scowl at the driver, who was definitely suppressing a smirk, Weiss begrudgingly followed the elder Schnee's orders and let out a sigh. Thankfully, it took a little wind out of the driver's tires, and he realized he should have opened the door for her, a mistake that was quickly corrected. As soon as it opened though, Weiss wished he had forgotten for a little longer and stepped inside.
"It's about time,"
Jacques snarled, winding the window back up as the reporters converged on the car.
"Your class ended 30 minutes ago. Where were you?" "My apologies, Father,"
she said back, hiding her disgust behind an apologetic smile.
"I was informing Headmistress Goodwitch about my need for time off. Had I known you would be waiting, I would have been quicker. Yes, well, it seems I can no longer trust you to even leave your college without making statements on behalf of the company.
Glancing to her side, Weiss saw that the white-haired man wasn't looking at her. However, she did need him to look at her to be able to hear the condemnation in his tone. It was very clear that he wanted an apology for that too. Not that it surprised her that what she'd said would come back to haunt her. After all, what didn't lately? But it did surprise her it had taken so long for the topic to be brought up.
Was the STC not preparing to make that announcement already?
She asked, determined to at least show some rebellion before she forced herself to give the man what he wanted.
We were,
Jacques growled, his eyes flicking to her as the car started up.
But certainly not in the way that you did it. What you were thinking in defending those beasts is beyond me. A once respectable organization.
His words were little more than a sarcastic sneer.
They've never been anything more than opportunists looking to slander our name. I thought it would show that the STC doesn't judge all fondness on the action of a few.
Weiss fired back, but quickly got a grip on her emotions. It wouldn't do to get into an argument with him the day before she leaves town.
But you were right, I should have waited. Yes, you should have,
he said, his dull drawl making her stomach churn.
You also should not have been leaving college when you were supposed to be attending class. My class was canceled, so I went for lunch. Against my instructions that specifically stated you were only allowed to attend college and work. It was due.
She was cut off by a glare from her father, and sighed inwardly.
It won't happen again. Good.
The man adjusted his tie a little, and pulled out his scroll to reply to a message.
I'm assuming Glinda approved your time away? She did,
Weiss replied.
She also informed me that they will be turning down the STC scholarship donation too.
He didn't seem bothered by that at all.
Hardly a loss for us. In fact, that saves us money. We've long since given too much anyway.
Weiss felt her fist clench at those words. The fact that one of the side effects of her plan had actually pleased her father stung, but the fact he didn't care about how many people were to be affected made her skin crawl. But the fact that Ruby was one of those affected made a stronger wave of hatred than she had felt since Winter had revealed her history run through her.
But I didn't come here to talk about unimportant things,
he said, and put his scroll away.
I'm leaving for Atlas tonight, and wanted to go over what will be happening in Mistral.
Despite her urge to punch the man, Weiss resisted and gave a small nod of her head. Almost everything had already been decided with Edward and Margaret, so everything Jacques was about to say would be disregarded. However, to at least give the impression that his word meant anything, she gave a small nod and turned, ready to ignore everything he said.
Sorry. I know we've just started to Phi. Yang. NGS, and I swear I'm not running. Yang.
What? The soft chuckle finally caused her to stop and look at her dad.
I'm not mad that you're taking a vacation with your girlfriend.
The man smiled, the simple action making his scruffy appearance look 10 years younger.
And I know you're not running all right. So relax.
Yang came to a stop in the middle of the street and turned to look at him. His blue eyes showed just how much he believed her, and she felt her stomach sink a little. As many issues as they were having, she really didn't want to lie to him. It was what caused their problems in the first place, after all.
Okay, that was a lie.
She sighed meekly and scratched her head.
I might be running a little bit.
Thankfully, the smile didn't fade from her dad's face. In fact, he didn't seem surprised at all, and gave a small shrug before starting to walk again. Quickly catching up, Yang fell into stride beside him again.
Are you still unsure about the therapy?
Yang breathed and put her hands into her pockets.
Do we really need therapy? Can't we just talk it out like usual? Like we are now? And then fight again in 6 months? Yes.
Both of them chuckled, but it quickly faded. Though Yang loved that they could still laugh together and make light of the seriousness of the situation, neither of them forgot that it was serious. Tai was right that if they didn't finally get to the bottom of everything, then they would just end up in the same situation again in the future. The past had shown that a number of times.
I just don't like strangers trying to get in my head.
She breathed with a small shrug of her own.
They always just want me to talk about Mom. And none of the good stuff about her either, just the accident. Like that's all she left me with. I know that feeling.
Tai hummed.
That's pretty much all I was asked about when I was in rehab.
It was very rare for her dad to talk about what his experience was like in rehab. The most he ever gave was a generalization of how much it sucked, but also how much it helped him. So to hear him actually talk about what it involved shocked her a little bit.
But I hear that this one is actually pretty good. Who even told you about him anyway?
Yang asked skeptically.
I searched him up, and he's way more expensive than anyone we know would go to see. Heh.
It was Ty's turn to scratch the back of his head.
Just a friend.
Yang scowled at him, since she was pretty sure that she already knew who it was. Dr. Dark was one of the best psychiatrists in all of Vale, and his practice was renowned for all sorts of things. While her and her father's friends weren't exactly hard-pressed for money, she knew for a fact that none of the people they were associated with had enough to casually see such a doctor.
When did she come to see you?
Ty chuckled again, but also shook his head.
Last week.
At least he admitted it. Yang wasn't annoyed though. The fact that Weiss cared enough to try and talk to her dad actually made her feel a little warm on the inside.
You finally found one with a good head on her shoulders. I thought you liked Arslan? Arslan was great, just not who you were destined to be with. Oh God, don't get started on destiny. And that Melanie girl? I still have no idea what you were thinking. Don't remind me.
Yang found herself chuckling and shook her head. Silence fell between them again though as they turned onto the street with Blake's store. It wasn't an uncomfortable one, just one that implied they were both thinking about things. Though she had no idea what Ty was thinking, Yang's mind was working over just how good it felt to talk and laugh with him again. Even though it was frequent, their relationship wasn't always fighting, and she genuinely did love being around him. And she really wanted that to be the norm for them. But to do that, she knew she would have to at least do something uncomfortable first. So with a small sigh, she stopped again just before they reached Blake's store and turned to face him again.
I'll do it,
she muttered with a sheepish smile.
If therapy is what we need to fix this, then you can call them the second I get back.
Though he tried to hide it, the small smile on his face was obvious.
You're sure?
Yang gave a small nod.
Yeah. Okay.
As the man moved closer to pull her into a hug, she wasn't even tempted to move away. Despite everything they were going through, his arm still felt safe. Even the kiss that was pressed against the top of her head was enough to make her smile and feel like a little girl again.
I'll get your insurance and stuff sorted while you're away too. You'll be able to ride Bumblebee the second you get back. Thanks.
She breathed and melted into his chest a little. After taking a couple of seconds to enjoy the feeling, she pushed her dad away and stuck her tongue out at him. With a shake of his head, they both walked towards the shop and stepped inside. As usual, the smell of coffee and chocolate permeated the air. With it being lunch though, chatter and laughter also filled their ears. Almost every table was occupied by people in suits either talking to one another or typing on their laptops, while Blake and Ilya worked behind the counter, though Yang definitely noticed that they seemed to be in deep conversation about something. Callie and Gyra walked around with trays of drinks and food. It wasn't too often that Gyra worked in the shop, but when he did, it was always a little weird to watch. Despite being a lawyer, the man had taken very good care of himself and maintained a tremendously muscular figure. Standing at almost 7 feet and probably just as muscular as Hazel, combined with his gentle heart and intelligence, it was easy to see why Callie was so enamored with her husband. But it was a funny sight to see such a large man in an apron weaving his way through the small space between tables.
Ty!
Gyra greeted them with a wide smile, despite his ankle catching one of the tables. Thankfully, Callie caught him with a hand to his chest and plucked the tray from his hand.
Aw, thank you, dear.
A quick kiss of gratitude was placed on the woman, and a wide grin broke over her face as she gave his bearded chin a scratch and walked off toward the counter with the dirty dishes.
You'd have broken your neck years ago if it weren't for that wife of yours.
Ty laughed as the two men's hands clasped together in a firm handshake.
Too true, my friend. Too true.
The man laughed before turning her way.
Afternoon, Yang. Hey, G.
She smiled back.
Little late for lunch rush, isn't it? Something happened at Tanning's that made a lot of workers stay late. Gotcha. I should get back though. She may have been smiling when she walked away, but if I start slacking then, she will soon be frowning. Definitely don't want to make her angry.
Ty chuckled.
I still remember when she cracked that robber over the head with a tray. As feisty as she is beautiful. I was in love the day I met her. I remember that feeling.
That caught Yang's attention.
See you on Wednesday for the game? Definitely. And is in the back corner waiting for you, by the way. Thanks.
The man left them alone, and Yang watched her dad lean back to see through the crowd. Seeing a woman in black dress with white and gold dots, she gave a small wave that was quickly returned. She had only met her dad's sponsor a few times, since it was standard to keep as much of their lives separate as they could, but she always seemed nice enough. Standing back up, she gave him a curious look.
What you just said to Gyra? Huh?
He asked, a little confused.
About falling in love with someone the day you met them? Was that Raven?
Tai stared at her for a couple of seconds, but then gave a small nod.
I really did love her, Yang,
he said firmly.
Yes, she is who I meant.
Yang smiled.
Thanks for being honest. That's all I'll be from now on.
He smiled back and reached out to ruffle her hair.
Good.
She breathed happily and knocked his hand away before he messed her hair up too badly.
Well, I'm gonna go talk to Blake and Ilya. Have fun. You too, Firecracker.
Watching the man walk away, she couldn't help but smile a little more at just how good it felt to talk to him again, and how much better it felt knowing he was going to be honest in the future. Even if they did have a lot to work on, they still had that at least. So letting that fact settle over her, she turned away from the man and walked towards the counter to talk to her friends, who were still in deep conversation with each other while facing away from the storefront.
Tomorrow,
she heard Ilya say when she got close, the girl's voice a little hushed. Thankfully, her hair was starting to return to its usual brown, but there were still hints of blue here and there.
I know,
Blake replied, her voice just as low as the other girl's.
But how do I tell her? I dunno, but you have to. Maybe I should wait until SH. Tell me what?
Yang joked, placing both arms on the counter and pulling a brownie from under the glass bowl. However, from the look on her friends' faces as they spun around, she was guessing her joke wasn't exactly far off. Blake hummed nervously, but tried to put a straight face on.
That, if you take another brownie, you're fired. Nice try.
She shot back and turned to the other girl.
Ilya? Not my place.
The girl shrugged and walked off. At least she confirmed that something was amiss.
Ilya,
Blake cut off with a sigh as the other faunus began to loudly set about stacking the clean plates. Noticing that, Blake seemed to deflate and fall against the counter herself. The grin finally left Yang's face, as that whatever they had been discussing was not actually something pleasant. She thought back a few days to their conversation on the roof, and despite feeling a little hurt that Ilya apparently knew, realized she needed to get Blake to talk. Especially if what she had overheard was true, and it involved her.
Blake? It's nothing, Yang.
The girl sighed and lifted her head from her arms.
It can wait till you get back, so just forget it. Is it the same thing that was bugging you the other day? The thing you needed time to think about? I said for. Well, that isn't going to happen, is it?
Yang fired back immediately, keeping her voice firm.
And since when did you tell Ilya things before me? It's not. She just found out? Fine.
Yang stood and crossed her arms defiantly, causing Blake to roll her eyes and shake her head.
Then I guess, since it sounds like it involves me, that I'm not moving from here until I just find out too. Don't be stupid, Yang,
Blake scolded.
We both know I'm very stupid,
she countered.
And my plane ticket is one of those fancy ones where I can leave whenever, so I've got as long as I like. Yang, don't do th.
Ignoring her friend, she turned around to a man who was sitting at a nearby table. Thankfully, he was a regular, so she tapped on his shoulder, and she motioned to the chair beside him when he turned to look at her. With a small nod, he offered it up and Blake began to lift it over the railing between them. However, before she could get it over, she heard Blake let out an annoyed groan behind her.
All right,
she hissed, her ears flattening against her head and her amber eyes burned with annoyance.
You win. I'll tell you.
Despite the girl's words, Yang saw doubt creep into her friend's eyes as they quickly scanned the storefront.
Jay just not here.
The girl pointed to the hatch that led behind the counter. A little suspicious about what could cause Blake to be so secretive, Yang replaced the chair and walked around to follow her to the back. However, while she thought they would simply stop there, Blake squeezed past her mother and continued toward the door that led to the apartment. That action alone made Yang a little nervous herself, but if it meant she was finally going to learn what had been bothering her best friend, then she was more than happy to follow. As they climbed, though, she noticed her best friend's pace had slowed. Whatever urgency the earlier conflict had given her was quickly fading, and each step was more hesitant than the last. Watching her, Yang's nerves turned to worry, and she felt a large wave of remorse for pushing her to do something she clearly didn't want to do yet. So, as carefully as she could, she placed a hand on Blake's back to get her attention. The girl stopped and turned around.
I'm sorry,
she said apologetically.
I shouldn't have done that. You don't have to tea. And no.
The raven-haired reader stuttered, her hand hanging low.
I do. I don't know how you'll take it. You're my sister, Blake.
She smiled and looked into her anxious eyes.
Whatever it is, I'll deal with it.
Blake gazed at her for a few seconds, then shook her head. Turning away without even returning the smile, she continued to climb the stairs to the apartment. When they finally entered the apartment, though, Blake quickly shut the door behind them, but didn't bother to turn around. Her ears were still flat against her head. Usually that means she was annoyed, but when her shoulders were slumped as they were, it meant she was scared. Yang couldn't actually remember the last time the girl was scared. Maybe it was Adam who confronted them in the alleyway. Maybe it was in the hospital afterwards. But fear was not something Blake showed regularly. So she wasn't surprised that the girl flinched. Yang put a hand on her back. But her quick breathing did cause Yang some concern.
Hey,
she cooed and spun. Blake's head still hung low.
Remember, I'm gonna love you regardless, okay? Just talk to me.
Placing a hand on the girl's cheek, she raised her sister's head and looked into her eyes again to reassure her. They were filled with uncertainty, but the longer they looked at each other, the more confidence seemed to seep into them. Though it wasn't a large amount by any means, it was enough so that Blake could at least hold her head up on her own.
Okay.
She took a breath.
You should sit down.
Giving a small nod, Yang let the girl go and moved towards the comfy couch. Though she was thankful Blake was feeling a little better, though not enough that her arms weren't hugging herself, she was a little nervous as to what Blake could possibly have to tell her. Normally the girl wouldn't hesitate to tell her something.
As so,
Blake began quietly.
You know how I've been a little distracted lately? Kinda hard not to notice,
she replied as she sat down. After a second of hesitation, Blake moved to the opposite couch and sat down too.
Well, it's not just been lately. It's been months.
Removing her arms from around herself, the girl began to wring her hands together.
These past months have been rough for me. I love this shop, I love working in it, and I also love writing and getting my weird little stories out there, even if only a few people read them. But neither have felt right for a while. I'm constantly distracted, and my mind is always elsewhere. And I'm tired of pretending it's not there. Where?
Yang asked, curious as to what could make Blake's mind stray so far from the thing she loved so much. The girl was refusing to meet Yang's gaze now, choosing to look at her hands instead. Yang had been prepared for pretty much anything. After what she just revealed, she half expected the girl to say she was quitting her job at the shop and maybe giving up writing, but she definitely hadn't expected the next words to come out of her best friend's mouth.
The meetings.
What had been a gentle atmosphere between the two of them quickly turned strained as silence descended upon them. Yang was sure she couldn't have heard that right.
What?
Her question was little more than a whisper.
I know what you're thinking, but it's not like that. Then explain it,
Yang ordered, feeling a heat starting to well inside her. Blake couldn't seriously be talking about what she thought.
I was just stepping in at first when another helper was out sick,
Blake blurted out.
But then I just stayed. I noticed. And the longer I stayed,
Blake's knee began to bounce in place.
The more I started to enjoy it. I've been helping people, letting them talk about their issues, helping them get job interviews and places to stay, and I really, really love doing that. But then I come back here to the shop. A shop you just said you love.
Yang didn't know when she'd stood up, but Blake was looking up at her with pleading eyes. They did nothing to calm the anger that she felt rising within her. How could she possibly be considering what I think she is? Yang thought to herself. Especially now of all times.
I do love the shop.
Blake stood to her feet, a hint of desperation in her voice.
And I love writing, but they're not the same. I'm not helping people here. I just serve people coffee. Isn't that what you and Callie wanted? Isn't that why you moved to Vale in the first place? It was. I thought it was, but doing this, Yang, it just feels right. And when I'm not doing it, I just feel useless. Like I'm doing nothing. But with a white F. You cannot be fucking serious right now.
She didn't mean to growl as she turned away from her best friend, only to turn back with an incredulous look.
You want to rejoin, don't you?
Of all the things to finally give Blake her confidence back, it just had to be that.
I do.
A million thoughts went through her head at that moment. Memories of everything they'd done together when they first joined, of all the shops they'd tagged and the fights they'd gotten into. The tattoo and the torment. Finding out about Shni Tower and then trying to leave, Adam almost killing them for it. The troubles at school because of their affiliation. Then came the other major thing. Weiss. Her girlfriend, who she was so madly in love with that the past few days away from her had only been bearable because she knew they were going on holiday together. Her girlfriend who had a scar as a result of the White Fang, whose company had just been attacked by the very same type of people barely a week ago. Of how her own history with the organization was going to make things tricky enough when they came out as it was. With all of that, with everything that had happened and was happening, how could she think it was in any way a good idea to rejoin, let alone that this was the right time for it? There could only be one explanation. One person who was responsible.
This is Luna, isn't it?
She said, pointing an accusing finger at the door.
She's got into your head like she did last time. This isn't Luna, Yang.
Blake denied immediately.
She hasn't even talked to me about it. And neither has Ilya before you ask. This is my choice. Bullshit. It's not. Of course it is. Why does it have to be her?
Blake said, getting heated herself and stepping forward.
Why can't you believe this is my decision? Because my best friend would never be this stupid.
Yang bellowed, the fondness not even flinching.
After everything we went through to get out of that mess. Everything that happened with Adam. I know that you couldn't be this much of a fucking idiot, Blake. Especially with what just happened in Atlas. These meetings are nothing like that, and you know it.
Blake countered.
Don't I? Did you forget that Luna's brother is in jail for taking part in the attack that almost killed Weiss? You know, my girlfriend. Your friend? How many times do I have to tell you? She played no part in that. Stop judging her by her brother's actions, especially when she's denounced him just as much as anyone else has. She is trying to help us. Bullshit. Once a recruiter, always a recruiter. And now you sound just like them. Who? Them,
Blake shouted.
The reason we need these meetings. The reason so many of us feel alone. Thinking we are monsters just because others were. I never said that, and you know it.
Yang growled, actually offended that Blake could even think she would ever judge a faunus for simple being a faunus.
I'm judging her based off of everything SHE has done. She got us into the White Fang in the first place, she asked us not to leave, she talked Ilya into staying, and now you want to join again after helping out at her meetings. What am I supposed to think when she is linked to every single one of those things? As my sister, you are supposed to understand that this is my decision. One that I made on my own without even talking to Luna about it.
Pulling away from her friend, Yang shook her head disbelievingly. She could feel tears stinging at her eyes as she looked at the girl who had helped her so much through her life.
Well, your timing really sucks, she breathed. Do you even care how this affects me? How this could fuck up everything I have with a girl I actually want to spend my life with? How much harder it will be when we come out to the public and her father discovers my best friend is part of the White Fang? Do you care about any of that?
Yang saw hurt enter Blake's eyes.
Of course I care, Yang,
she said, trying to close the distance between them. Yang didn't let her.
I know how much you care about Weiss, she's my friend too. But I can't put my life on hold anymore. I can't keep denying that this is what I want to do. It's making me miserable.
Yang felt a tear roll down her cheek. She knew in her heart that Blake was right, that she shouldn't have to put her life on hold. But it wasn't fair. Why did it have to be now? Why did she have to find what she wanted to do when things were finally about to turn around? Ty, Raven, Weiss, Blake, Yang was about to have it all. Why couldn't Blake have waited a few months to make the realization? But no, it just had to be when everything was about to be perfect that the ugly reality of just how much she could lose reared its head again. It had to be just before everything was perfect that it all fell to shit. It had to just be like every other time in her life. So as those thoughts rushed through her head, and she felt another tear roll down her cheek, she shouldered her way past Blake and threw the door open.
Yeah?
The door slammed shut just as more tears spilled down her face, blocking out Blake's call completely as she ran down the stairs and pushed her way into the alleyway. She had no idea where to go. She had no idea of anything at that moment. All she knew was she had to get as far away from things as she could. Chapter 62, Mistral. There was always a more relaxed atmosphere around when Jacques was away, an atmosphere that Weiss definitely liked more than when he was home. In truth, she didn't quite hate the mansion itself, though she wasn't overly fond of it either. It was more that there just so happened to be a bad memory associated with every single room. Over the years, she'd either been shouted at and punished in each one of them, or at least watched or listened to someone she loved get the same treatment. But the cause of those memories was gone, at least for a while, and the rooms felt a little more innocent than when the man was home. That didn't mean that Weiss was free of worry as she made her way to breakfast though. No, there was still plenty of that. She still had to think on what she was going to do regarding Ruby's scholarship, or lack thereof, how she was going to convince Fletch into agreeing to start up his company with her. A new one had also been added to her worry list, since her bank had notified her of a transaction from her personal account registered to a 3-star hotel in Mistral. Before authorizing it, she checked in with Yang and gotten confirmation it was her, but nothing as to why she was already in Mistral. Needless to say, it worried Weiss a little, but she knew it was still too early to call her and ask. Besides, she would be there in a few hours anyway. But her jet wasn't due to take off for another few hours, and even then, she would have a meeting the second she arrived. She hated that she would have to keep Yang waiting when she sensed something had happened, but it was unavoidable. So with a small sigh at that fact, she pushed the door to the dining room open to see her mother and brother sitting at the table. Just as always, Whitley seemed to be purposely ignoring the woman while Willow surveyed him out of the corner of her eye, though her attention did pull away from him as she entered the room.
Good morning, daughter,
the woman said, pushing a plate of eggs Benedict towards her.
Are you eager for your trip today? I am,
Weiss replied with a smile as she sat down.
Though it will be mostly business, it will be good to see Mistral again. That might change when you get there, sister.
Whitley scoffed and cut into his pancakes, which were so covered in syrup that it was practically dripping from every slice.
The economic crash has turned it into a dump. Or so I hear. Mistral has always been a beautiful city, son. I would love to visit again one day. Yes, I'm sure there are plenty of vineyards, th. Whitley.
Weiss' scolding tone stopped the boy in his tracks, but didn't squash the defiance in his eyes. Nor did it stop the hurt from seeping into their mothers. The hurt quickly faded though, and she let out a small sigh.
It's fine, Weiss,
she said in a heavy tone.
Your brother is right to be angry with me.
In the corner of her eye, she saw Whitley look at the woman for what she believed was the first time in years. Apparently the validation of his anger had been enough for him to finally show some interest. Turning to look at him herself, Willow let out another sigh and placed her fork down.
I haven't been a mother to him. I haven't been a mother to either of you. Living with your father, it was too much, and it became easier to keep myself blind to everything that happened. I chose the easy way out, and I make no excuses for that. But I am trying to change that now. I am trying to be the mother you should have had.
Whitley's eyes bored into their mother's, like they had into Weiss months ago. She knew just how strong her brother's gaze was, how unnerving it felt to have him scour your very soul for a single lie, so was impressed that her mother held it with a firm gaze of her own. She did remember that her mother had the same gaze before everything had happened and she'd given herself to the wine, so figured that was where the boy had inherited it from. However, Weiss didn't know what he saw in them, but when the woman tried to reach out and touch his hand reassuringly, he snatched it away and stood from his chair. With a scowl that seemed a little less vicious than normal, he picked up his plate of food and left the room. Sadly shaking her head, Willow picked up her fork again and meekly picked at her breakfast.
He just needs some time,
Wise said softly, giving her mother a smile.
I know,
Willow said.
Anger at least means he cares apparently. It does.
Cutting into her own breakfast, she took a bite while her mother processed things. While it definitely wasn't bad, since the family chef was world-class, the eggs Benedict paled in comparison to Yang's. Maybe it was because Yang's actually tasted like they were made with love and not obligation, but she hoped as she ate that she would taste them again soon.
So,
conversation with her mother was still a little awkward, but it was slowly getting better.
Have you anything planned while I'm away? I was thinking of catching up with an old medical friend,
the platinum-haired woman said, looking a little more upbeat.
It's been a while, but I think I still know a few things. You're thinking of practicing again? I'm not sure. It's been so long that I would most likely have to start all over again. So much has changed since I left. Well, I think it would be good for you to have something that gets you out of the house.
Her words caused her mother to give her a knowing look, but she could hardly blame her. The attempt had been less than subtle.
You don't have to keep trying to protect me, Weiss,
the woman said slowly.
That's supposed to be my job with you and your brother. We're a family, Mom,
Weiss replied, placing the last of her breakfast into her mouth and savoring it. It might now have been Yang's, but it was still her favorite for a reason.
We're supposed to protect each other.
A small smile stretched across her mom's face, and Weiss felt a hand reach out to rest against hers. Unlike her brother, she was more than happy to hold it back and return the attempt at bonding. She was happy their relationship was slowly getting better after all, happy that her mom was successfully digging herself out of the spiral that Jacques had sent her into. There was still a long way to go with Whitley, but for Weiss, that was enough.
I suppose that is true,
the woman said, and restricted her hand.
So, anything exciting planned while you are in Mistral? Surely you will have some free time. I will more than likely be working most of the time,
Weiss sighed, leaning back in her chair.
The situation is a mess with how long he has left it, but I may be able to explore a little. Well, if you do, the Hanakatoba Gardens are beautiful this time of year. I will keep that in mind.
Smiling at her mom, Weiss felt her scroll buzz in her pocket. Pulling it out, she looked to see the alarm she'd set to notify her when it was almost time for her to leave. So pushing her plate away a little, she raised to her feet.
But I should be getting ready,
she said politely.
Hazel will be here any minute. Of course.
Willow smiled and stood up too, walking around the table to meet her at the door. A hand was raised lovingly to Weiss' cheek, and the pale blue eyes gazed kindly down at her.
Remember to enjoy yourself, daughter. Work is not all there is in life. I will, Mom,
she said with a nod, moving in to give the older woman a quick hug.
Good.
Though Weiss spent an extra second in her mom's arms, the nostalgic feeling making her a little warm inside, she eventually pulled away and gave her mom another smile. It may only be a week, but she was actually going to miss the breakfasts they had begun to share in recent weeks. However, knowing she still had to pack a few last things and say goodbye to her brother, especially after what had just happened, Weiss gave the woman one last nod and pulled the door open so that she could get ready to leave.
What do you want, sister?
The boy's voice was hard and icy, his eyes like frozen glaciers as he stared daggers at her. A few months ago, it would have given her pause, but she was used to her brother's bark, which was always worse than his bite. So with a shake of her head, she leaned against the door frame and gave him a smile.
Mom is trying, Whitley. Well, she can stop wasting her time. I'm not interested. If that's true, why are you angry? Because I hate having my time wasted,
he snarled.
Which it will have been when she returns to drinking. How can you be sure?
She walked into the room, letting out a small sigh at her brother's stubbornness.
You haven't even given her a chance. She doesn't deserve one. Did I?
He didn't reply straight away, instead looking down at the floor. She knew she had done worse than their mother had to the boy by abandoning him, but he had forgiven her anyway. And she also knew that he cared since he tended to stay pretty reserved about anything he didn't have strong feelings towards.
Look,
she put a hand on his shoulder.
I'm not saying you have to forgive her, that's your choice. But you were right when you said that I remember Mom being around when I was younger, and I remember that she was an amazing person. She's been through some hard times, just like us, but I do believe she is really trying her best to get better.
The boy turned away, his eyes still icy cold, but his brow furrowed in thought. Knowing she had at least got through to him a little, she backed off and gave him a smile. She didn't expect the anger to fade straight away, however, so wasn't surprised to see him shake his head in disbelief. But it was a little less angry than when she walked in.
Now, I have some last things to pack,
she said painfully.
I was wondering if you wanted to help me. I am not a servant.
I know.
But I would rather spend a little time with my brother before I leave than the new staff that were hired.
She and Whitley shared an understanding look. The new staff were more uptight than the old ones, reporting almost every move they made back to their employer. It had made it incredibly annoying, especially when they didn't even seem to be interested in small talk like the others were. Even in the few minutes one of the new women had helped her pack, Weiss couldn't help but miss Viola.
Fine,
he grumbled, throwing his scroll onto his bed and pushing his way past her. Exhaling with another shake of her head, she took off after him. Weiss took a deep breath of warm air as she stepped off of her plane onto the tarmac, the sun shining down from above. She'd always loved the air in Mistral, the smell of fragrant spices and flowers that seemed to permeate every inch of the city. Since Mistral was built into a mountain that had a waterfall at the very top, the smell of fresh water and dirt also mingled with them in a pleasant way, neither too heavy as to overtake them, but enough to add a slight fresh smell to everything. However, as beautiful as the city smelled, it was nothing compared to how it looked. With most of the houses set slightly into the mountain, the city looked like it had existed from the very first day Remnant came to be. However, along the plateaus and roads that wound their way up the great mound of earth, additional houses of white stone stood almost side by side, their ornate tiles roofs a variety of colors that ranged from red to yellow to green. Looking over the railing that lined the end of the private runway, she saw the same was true for the other levels of Mistral True.
Welcome, Miss Schnee.
Looking back up, she saw a middle-aged man with shoulder-length purple hair dressed in a light purple kimono giving her a slight bow. Covering his legs was a blue hakama. She recognized him immediately.
It's a pleasure to have you here. How was your flight? It's a pleasure to be here, Omi-san,
she said with a smile, returning the bow.
We flew over Lake Matsu. It was quite the sight. Though your city is still as beautiful as ever. Thank you, thank you.
The man's accent was heavy from one of the many Mistralian dialects, but his valet was still perfect.
I would love to show you around before we meet with the rest of the council. That would be perfect. My mother told me that Hanakatoba Gardens are beautiful this time of year.
The man gave an odd chuckle, but a smile appeared on his face nonetheless.
Yes, they are,
he said slowly while casting his arm out in a sweeping motion towards an elevator.
But we should keep some distance between us. It wouldn't be good for people to get the wrong impression. What impression would they be getting?
She asked while walking to the large box made of metal and glass, a little confused as to what had bothered the man so much.
You said your mother told you of it? She mentioned its beauty, nothing more. I'm guessing there is a story there that she neglected to tell me. A few.
The man scratched his head, but gave a small shrug of his shoulders.
Though its official name is Hanakatoba, the locals refer to it as, well, I suppose in Valak it would be Lovers' Reunion. It is quite a popular dating spot for couples. Oh, well, we definitely do not want to be giving the people that impression.
She chuckled.
No, we do not,
the man said, his tone easing up a little. Giving the man an easy smile as the elevator began to move, she walked up to one of the wide windows and looked out at the passing levels. Along the roads, she saw more and more people, all dressed in elaborate clothing of so many colors they would make a rainbow jealous. Kimonos, shamsongs, robes, cloaks, saris, hijabs, akans, even more plain choices such as jeans and t-shirts. The styles of clothing in Mistral were about as varied as its dialects. Though, that was to be expected from the world's most culturally diverse city. Mistral was full of people from all over the world. From Atlas to Menagerie, Vale to Vacuo, even the Wyvern Isles that laid west of Solitas, pretty much every culture was represented in Mistral. And as such, the city had become renowned for its wide array of art and theater, and the whole world looked toward it as the leaders of fashion statements. If something was fashionable in Mistral, there was a high likelihood that it would be seen in other parts of the world too. However, due to its size, and just how easy it was to hide, it had also become known for its crime. For every beautiful theater that someone could name within the city, they could also name a gang or criminal enterprise. And that wasn't to mention the more ugly things about the city, like the constant racial tension between the humans and the faunus that was almost as bad as Atlas. From her understanding, there was no place that was represented more than in the factories that littered the lower levels, where the faunus to human ratio of workers was quite alarming due to cheap manual labor being most of the work faunus could get. That had been in part due to the previous emperors and empresses. While many had been okay, just as many had been terrible, but the last had been the worst. The last emperor of Mistral had been an extremely xenophobic man, hating the cultures that had invaded his city, and decided to side with Atlas during the war in hopes to root them out and return the kingdom to how it used to be. Needless to say, when the war had finished, the kingdom forcefully stripped him of all power and opted to follow the other kingdoms in electing a council to lead them instead. Unfortunately, a lot of Mistral's past ugliness was still visible, though the situation had improved quite a bit since that day. She knew for a fact that the council member standing just behind her, Mr. Sanjay Umi, was an avid advocate of faunus rights, and was even married to a faunus with kids. His work in making the city much more hospitable for faunus with constant pushback against anti-faunus policies and proactive stances on furthering the Equal Opportunities Act, the man was well respected by most of the citizens. He was also someone Weiss definitely wanted on her side, so that the STC could help him further those goals in the future.
Enjoying the view, Miss Schnee?
Looking back, she smiled at the man.
I remember the first time my father brought me here,
she replied.
I was so in awe with all the colors and the clothing. He even took me to a performance that night after a meeting.
Weiss felt her voice cut out at having remembered a memory with her father that was actually quite good. With how few there were, she'd forgotten they did actually exist.
Well, I doubt I need to tell you how mesmerizing they are. Those things are undeniably beautiful,
he chuckled, walking up to her side and waving to a few citizens who were waiting for the elevator to pass so that the path would return to normal and allow them to continue.
Though even I often find them a little, I forget the word AUS something. Ostentatious? That's the one. Though, I must admit, they have been a little bit more comforting given recent troubles. The economy? MHM. It hurts to see my beloved city in such a way. Well, while I won't pretend we can solve all of your problems, I'm hoping there is something the STC can do to aid you in that regard. But that is all stuff for the meeting later. Of course. A lot to discuss, and it would be better to not have to repeat it.
She gave a nod of confirmation and received a smile in return.
Instead, since you are so eager to see them, how about I tell you the story of how Hanakatoba received its other name? It's one of my wife's favorites.
The elevator came to a stop, and Weiss stepped out onto the large balcony that overlooked even more of the city. Turning around, she looked at the man and gave a courteous smile.
I would be glad to hear it while we walk there.
There were a couple of benefits to being in a new city for a while. The most obvious was that it was a nice change of scenery, but Weiss generally liked Vale, so that wasn't too big of a thing for her. The two things about being in Mistral that did please her, however, was that, since the trip was so last minute and kept under wraps, the press had likely not found out that she was in town just yet. The other good thing was that, even if they had, Mistral was so big a labyrinthine that finding her would be very difficult for them. So, after 4 hours spent in a meeting room discussing living wages and what the STC could do to help boost Mistral's economy, Weiss was happy to stretch her arms as she walked down the streets of the beautiful city. In one hand was a coffee, the steaming hot brown liquid tasting like heaven after the long day so far, and in the other was her scroll. The moment she'd left the meeting, the first thing she had done was message Yang, and was happy that she had received one in return. However, even through texts, Weiss could tell something was wrong. While the messages were lighthearted, there was something a little short about them. The usual attempts at teasing and silly emojis were nowhere to be found, and instead, she just seemed to want to talk about how the meeting had gone. Fortunately, though, she was near where Yang was supposed to be waiting for her, so it wouldn't be long before she found out the truth anyway. She assumed that it was the same thing that made Yang leave Vale a day early, but the woman was refusing to talk about it. Every time she asked, Yang simply deflected the questions by saying that, for once, she may as well be a little early. The immediate thought, though, was that something had happened with Tai. Weiss knew Yang had been meeting him again the day before, and she also knew their situation was still a little tenuous, but she wasn't certain, so didn't want to make any assumptions. Especially since, despite everything he and Yang were going through, she still thought he was a good man who was genuinely interested in doing whatever it took to fix things. Thankfully, as she turned a corner towards a ledge that looked out over the large plains outside Mistral, she saw the familiar head of wild blonde hair on a bench just ahead of her. Looking around her to see that not too many people were around, and those that were around were in a rush, so gave a small smile and quietly walked up behind her girlfriend.
"Hi, sunshine,"
she whispered, slipping her arms around the boxer's shoulders.
"Enjoying the view?"
The blonde's head slowly turned to face her, the lilac eyes gleaming in the sunlight.
"Better now,"
she smiled, though it definitely wasn't as bright as it usually was. Wanting to fix that, and not really caring about the risk since nobody could really make out who they were from behind, Weiss pressed a light kiss against the woman's lips. Just as when they had gone on their last date, she couldn't help but enjoy the fact she was doing it so openly. She also liked that she felt Yang's smile widen a little before she pulled away.
"You sure this isn't too public?" "Not really, but I don't care,"
Weiss breathed, letting the brawler go so that she could walk around the bench and sit next to her.
"We are coming out soon anyway." "But didn't Winter say that we need to make sure your father finds out from us first?" "And he will. But this is our holiday. I want to enjoy it." "I do too,"
Yang mumbled.
"Just don't want to make things harder."
Glancing at her girlfriend, Weiss saw that the smile had dropped already as the woman looked back out over the horizon. Something was definitely wrong with her. She could see it in the way Yang's shoulders were slumped, how her lilac eye held a darker glint, while in the shadows her hair cast, and most notably, in how her fingers were picking at each other. In an attempt to show how little she cared about being seen at that moment, she reached out and tried to take one, but Yang pulled hers away.
"Yang?"
No reply.
"Hey."
She shifted in her seat a little, getting a better look at how little attention Yang was paying to what she was looking at.
"What's wrong?" "It's nothing, Weiss,"
Yang replied, not even turning to look at her.
"Well, that is clearly a lie. Something we said we wouldn't do anymore."
That caught the blonde's attention, and her head turned to face her direction. Not giving the woman time to pull away again, Weiss reached out and took a hand with her own, giving her a reassuring smile in the process.
"Talk to me."
Lilac eyes finally locked onto her own, and the blonde let out a small sigh. With a shake of her head, she pulled hand free and stood from the bench to walk towards the railing. Leaning against it, her hands holding the metal with a white knuckle grip, the woman let her head drop and let out a low groan.
"I had a fight with Blake,"
Yang said quietly, her voice sounding a little tired.
"And it's all such a mess. I can't help but feel my life is just making things worse for us in the future. With your dad. How does a fight between you and Blake make things worse for us?"
Weiss asked, confused as to how the brooding blonde had come to that conclusion.
"Because she—"
Yang stopped and let out a low, frustrated breath as she shook her head.
"You're probably gonna freak, but like you said, no more lies."
The girl turned around and gave her a worried look.
"She wants to rejoin the White Fang."
Weiss simply stared at her girlfriend as those words left Yang's lips. From the way the lilac eyes were looking at her, it was clear they were nervous about how she would react, but Weiss felt a little odd. She should be freaking out as Yang had said. She should have been worried due to everything going on with that organization in Atlas, but she wasn't. For some reason, what Yang had just revealed didn't bother her. Not much, at least.
"Okay,"
she said slowly, standing up from the bench herself and walking up to Yang's side.
"I definitely see how this affects us now. You're not freaking out?"
The disbelief in Yang's voice would have been obvious to a complete stranger.
"You're not concerned about this?" "Of course I'm concerned, Yang,"
Weiss replied, placing her hands on the rail and looking out over the rolling crop field.
"And you're right that this will make things more difficult for us. Jacques will definitely use this against us. But Blake is my friend, and I know that she is a good person and that there are good parts of the White Fang. So no, I'm not freaking out."
Weiss looked to her side and found Yang staring at her.
"But you already know all that better than I do. So the real question is, why are you freaking out?"
Yang turned around too so that she could face the fields and let out another long sigh. Folding her arms on the railing, she rested her head on them for a second before glancing back up, a faraway look in her eyes.
"I guess because it took so much for us to leave."
Yang said sadly.
You didn't see her back then. She wasn't like Adam or anything, but she fell into it pretty hard. It took so much begging to finally get her to see how wrong he was, and then it almost cost us our lives to get out. Blake told me about that,
Weiss said, remembering the discussion she'd had with the girl in the store.
But that was all Adam, not Blake. It wasn't just Adam. It was Luna too, even though Blake says she has nothing to do with her making this choice. The person running those meetings Blake and Ilya go to?
Yang turned to look at her, and she gave a meek smile.
Ruby mentioned her. Said you don't get along? That's an understatement.
Yang shook her head.
She's the one who got us into the White Fang. Blake and Ilya met her at a protest, and things went from there. Then I joined, and then she invited Adam. Then your tower was attacked. Her brother, Perry, was involved and arrested, and she completely cut ties with him. Their parents even ripped up his adoption papers. But even after all that, she tried to get us to stay, which Ilya did. Luna knew everything going on with Blake and Adam, knew how bad he'd become, knew how much we wanted out, but still told us that leaving was the wrong choice. And now, Blake wants to rejoin because of meetings that she runs. I just don't trust her. Well, it sounds like you have good reasons not to,
Weiss replied honestly. Though it certainly sounded like Luna hadn't been involved in the attack in any way, it did sound like she hadn't cared about Yang's and Blake's feelings about it afterwards, and had even stood by and allowed whatever was happening between Blake and Adam to continue without stepping in. From Weiss' point of view, knowing how much that time weighed on them both women and just how much Blake went through, that was enough to show her that Yang was right not to trust Luna. But if what Yang said was true, then it wasn't Luna who was influencing Blake, it was Blake's own personal feelings.
So I guess you will just have to trust Blake,
she said softly.
I do trust her, and I always will. I'm just worried. What if she goes down that path again? She won't.
Weiss smiled confidently and reclaimed her girlfriend's hand.
We both know how much she regrets how things turned out last time, and just how smart she is. I don't doubt she'll do things right this time.
Resting her head on Yang's shoulder a little, she let out a small chuckle.
Besides, I know that you will never let that happen again. And neither will I.
Feeling Yang looking down at her, Weiss waited patiently for the woman to come to the conclusion that she knew she would. Though the blonde had obviously been upset by Blake's decision, Weiss knew that there was nothing that would separate the two sisters, and that Yang simply needed someone to be a little more rational for her. Thankfully, Weiss was happy to be that, and would continue to be if required, but it didn't seem necessary since Yang let out a capitulated sigh and kissed the top of her head.
I still don't like it, but I guess you're right,
she breathed, the blonde's head resting atop her own.
As usual. Actually, I'm left-handed.
For the first time that day, Weiss felt a genuine laugh vibrate through the woman's body, and couldn't stop the wide smile that pulled at her lips.
That was terrible,
Yang chuckled.
But I love you for trying. Anything to get you to laugh.
Weiss grinned, her thumb running over the back of Yang's hand.
And please stop beating yourself up about stuff that will make my father angrier. Remember that you have been dealing with us being a secret for 6 months because of me, so whatever we have to deal with after we come out, it's worth it to me. Okay? Okay,
the blonde said resolutely with a small nod.
Good.
Weiss stood up straight again, giving the blonde a flirtatious smile.
Now, before we go and sort out the hotel, can we please go and get something to eat? Because I'm famished.
Watching Yang look around them, she was very happy when the woman saw that they were still very much alone and pressed a kiss upon her. More than happy to accept it, Weiss moved into the kiss and let out a small hum as warmth rushed through her body. The mere knowledge that she would be able to do such a thing even more openly in little over a week filled her with joy, which she expressed with a side smile at her girlfriend when she pulled away.
I could do with some food too.
Yang beamed down at her, the smile finally as bright as the sun that hung over Mistral.
Let's go!
And that's all for today, thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.